Alfonse, especially for these beautiful introductions and conclusions that helps us to levitate. Maybe you conclude in this very interesting way on only on necropolitics, but on necroeconomics. And I want to come back onto one figure that I'm not sure I grasped properly. You said that there was 3 million Malay workers that arrived, and then
Tamil
that arrived in Malaysia. How can you come back on these figures that you gave, because they were quite striking, and I was trying to grasp them.
I mean, Tamil migration, or rather migration from what is now South India to Malaya, of course, occurred along the British colonial networks that were very much integrated into the expansions of the British Empire. And you find traces of Indian workers, not just in Southeast Asia, but also in Caribbean, in Africa, basically where the Brits went, they took their favorite colony. And the kind of 4 million figures was kind of taking place over the course of almost a century. And what is really interesting in that kind of demographic was the fact that as this kind of indentured laborers that also simultaneously occupied a structural position as settlers, they were really liminal relative to actually any forms of state protection. They were barely recognized as British subjects, but they were very much recognized as British fodder. So in thinking about, for example, the statistics of 4 million, and of which 1 million, just straight up dies of whatever reasons, it became a very specific way of calibrating other kind of identities as well as social groups, also within the context of the British Indian demographic. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, there's something that is quite striking and that actually popped through my mind as you were both talking in these two spaces. Is there is a very important myth that environmental historians have worked through, and actually I'm thinking here of Diana Davis, which I believe, Gregory, you did a translation, right, of this really important text. And it was mentioned in the discussion before, the idea that for the colonizer, for example, of arid lands, the autochthons did not deserve the land because they had somehow not been able, they had, gone through, especially in Northern Africa, there was this idea from the French colonizer that the overexploitation of the environment there had led to desertification. Therefore, the local would, quote unquote, not deserve the land because they were not able to bring agriculture there. And there's also a quite similar counterpoint myth that you seem to approach here, which is this idea of there is an overabundance of vegetation, an overabundance that was not mastered properly, and therefore the colonizer should come and rectify this kind of element. And so that myth of pretty much the power of this belief of the settler trying to rectify a climate to give it the shape that would allow a quote-unquote proper utilization is something that is very striking in your two examples, whether by an overabundance or a lack. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Thank you. That's a really interesting thought. I think a couple of things come to mind with this. One is there was a similar narrative with the Russian imperial settlers about the ways that the forests were used by local people. So it was kind of idea that the forests were damaged by the ways that they had been used, which is interestingly actually evaluation which occurs through time by various groups about the people who preceded them. So it was also an evaluation in the 1990s about the Soviet uses of the forest. So there's a lot of the interpretation of the state of the forest, I think it can be molded to suit political ends. Because as I said, forests, they're very ambiguous in what is damage to a forest.
That being said, in the case that you study, what is interesting is the forest was saved in the end. I mean, it was so how, you came onto it, but can you come back a bit and what led to maintaining that specific walnut forest and not decide to chop it entirely, like such as it was the case in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I suppose, I don't know about saved, but definitely it wasn't. We can imagine another.
It wasn't destroyed.
Yeah, it wasn't destroyed. Yeah.
You're right. Let's be more nuanced.
Yeah, I guess we can imagine another fate for the forest, which is the fate of many forests in times of industrialization, which is that they're destroyed, something else is there, or they turned into a plantation, like in your case. So, I mean, yeah, what happened was not exactly just like perfect preservation, but definitely not, they weren't destroyed or replaced by plantation, and I think that's very important. But yeah, your question was about the causes, and the main thing was what I said about the connection with water. So out of this quite destructive myth, which also caused the desiccation of the Aral Sea, which is a huge inland sea, partly Kazakhstan, partly Uzbekistan, and generally it caused a lot of destruction across the whole Fergana Valley, but it did sort of inadvertently bring about the persistence of the forests. As well as this, there was also kind of recognition of the biodiversity of the forests. I didn't mention that they're not only walnut forests. Walnut trees are the most common, but also plum, cherry, apples. So there was also this kind of, yeah, the modern idea of conservation was also at work.
Alfonse, the reaction?
No, I think that's a great point of interpellation as well, because the kind of agro-capital regime in colonial Southeast Asia is pretty actually consistent across the French Indochina, Dutch-owned the Dutch East Indies, as well as, of course, the British East Indies, where the idea of productivity is as much bound to the conception of enclosure as much as it is also towards a moral economy of race as made relevant to empire. And I raise this because to kind of think about even cultivation, which is a kind of concept that was really, really central to the British Imperial Botanical Garden network, was itself predicated upon a kind of violence. Cultivation or to care, for example, the growth of this economic botanical specimen existed because the locals couldn't accomplish some kind of function with industrial that allows it to kind of compete with the industrial logics and desires of empires. But on the other hand, the empire also refuses to see the potentials in which local situated environmental knowledges or even different kinds of settler knowledges could lead to innovations in cultivation and propagation. And what was really interesting, for example, with regards to this, is actually in thinking about access to land. So, of course...
access or excess? Sorry. Access or excess?
Access, like
okay.
access card.
Okay.
Yeah, not like, there's excess vegetables in our lunch today. So, access in that way also points to the ability to, for example, configure land and to use land as an alienable asset. So following the signing of the Pankow Treaty, what was most important was that they immediately reformed land policies, and thus land became an asset class. But that asset class came with restriction. Not everyone who came to Malaya can do it. If you're a local Malay peasant, you can keep whatever customary land you have been using, as long as you have been cultivating for a long time and you give 10% of whatever thing you grow to the empire, to the administration. If you're British, if you're Indian, or if you're Chinese, you can work it, you can be a plantation laborer, you can lease out a mine, but you cannot own land. And this is, came to a very interesting point where the kind of growth cycle of rubber as a cash crop has a very specific temporality that in a way has also kind of created this regime of risk and uncertainty that is hand in hand tied with the development of financial markets in Southeast Asia, thinking about London Stock Exchange, Hong Kong Stock Exchange, or Shanghai Stock Exchange, because your plantation will not turn a profit for your first 7 years because your rubber trees are still growing. And thus you need to find a way to consolidate and kind of have this perpetual influx of capital so that your plantation asset could continue. So what happened in the end was a lot of these entrepreneurs from Europe, they couldn't manage a plantation. They didn't know what the fuck they were doing. They were, you know, a small child from Paris, and they come to Malaysia, and they're like, oh, everything grows, but actually everything grows and then dies immediately after and then grows again. And thus, they couldn't maintain that kind of consistency. And what happened within this kind of European capital network was that it led to a lot of consolidation, corporate consolidations, as kind of these professional managers ended up swallowing all these small plantations and ended up as massive plantation conglomerates. But on the other hand, the Chinese, they were learning that, you know, just because you grow rubber in a plantation doesn't mean you can't grow other things. So they started planting pineapples, and the pineapples grow at the roots of the rubber tree, which of course created pineapples that you can then tin and sell, but also the humidity that was created by the pineapple shrubs underneath the rubber tree prevented parasites and insects from attacking it, and in so doing, optimized rubber extraction. So these are the kind of
So it's not monoculture, but it's dual culture in that case, like that is promoted from?
Those words didn't exist back then, so I would say that the Chinese really needed to turn a quick buck, and pineapples grew really fast. Yeah. It's incidental, it's not quite dual culture, because they planted whatever they can in between the spaces of all the rubber tree, just in case something grew and they can sell it. But in this way, this kind of approach to productivity is also what anchors the kind of racial capital regime, and ultimately it is tied in to land, to abundance. And I have a very quick anecdote on that as well regarding language. The word jungle, which was kind of intermittently used before they opened up the land for cultivation, the word jungle came from Jangala, which is Sanskrit for wasteland. Oh, wow. And in thus thinking about the kind of conversion of jungle into forest, into plantation, reviews ultimately this choreography of economic progression that I think is very much embedded and infiltrates the logics of the frontier expansion in Southeast Asia.
That's a very interesting point, like this origin of the word jungle, which actually, I mean, you know, you can draw a parallel with the fact that savage come from Sylvestre, Sylvestre being like the forest, like this, you know, like still like this idea of a front that needs to be pushed, of a myth of the frontier that have been developed a lot by environmental historians. Rachel, like, what I want to ask you, maybe, I mean, you did talk actually about like this. I call it a legend rather than a myth because, I mean, I come with a very basic distinction, and I'm probably very wrong, but I do think that the legend answers to something that is smaller into scale than myth that tends to be, you know, like on a vaster cosmological level. But here comes again the idea of a paradise for the Aslan-Bab forest in terms of its origin, and that's interesting. How do people compose with like those different legends today in the field work that you work? And I say people, like I'll refine it, because yesterday we spoke very beautifully with Gabriela of how you can only do the ethnography of a relationship. You cannot extract knowledge from them, and that's something that is very important and that you're, I believe, fully aware in your work. But it's interesting, no, that like this idea of such a paradise comes back in.
Yeah, I think it's complicated because actually it does touch on this question of positionality in the kinds of things that people told me because they were telling me as part of a relationship. And yeah, so there are some myths that didn't reach me, I think, because of who I was and because of the kinds of relationships I was in. And I know you mentioned Saodat's work. She has a film about a way of relating to the forest that was never spoken to about with me, because maybe I will be brief because it could take a while to explain, but idea that if you go to sleep under a walnut tree, it's a dangerous thing to do because there are spirits in the walnut tree that can enter your dreams and cause chaos or make you ill. And I never heard this, and when I spoke to 𝗱𝗲𝘂𝘁𝗃, she told me about it. I saw her film, and I was very, like, I don't know, I really blown away, because, yeah, I lived in Istanbul for over a year, and no one spoke to me about this, and it's because it's a bit under the surface because of like these mystical ways of relating to the forest have been a bit obscured, I guess, or pushed down by a different kind of Islam, like less mystical Islam people have become more committed to recently, which is also happening unevenly across Central Asia. That's a very brief version, but anyway, I think it's very relevant to your question, Martin, because, yeah, the kinds of, I don't know, legend, I know what you mean about this semantic thing, but I didn't actually think about it before, like what is legend, what is myth?
I'm not sure about my thing. It's a proposition I make here. It's
a good point.
I am not a mythologist, unlike some of you here. And of course, like it touches on like a tricky question for you, which is like, how do you place yourself with this very notion of, I mean, there is an Orientalist tradition of extracting knowledge, and how do you practice through that today when you go to 𝗱𝗲𝘂𝘁𝗃? How do you grapple with that difficulty?
Yeah. So I suppose in two ways it's engagement with lineage, because in one way, as Gabriella was saying yesterday, it's trying to hold and recognize that you carry a history which goes beyond your own life. That is one thing. And then the other thing is that so many people have written about and practiced working with these power relations. And so in a way, I'm also working with those people and what they have done. And then I remember yesterday, Gabriella and Nastasia were talking about making mistakes, and I think it's like this ongoing process where you will always make mistakes. I suppose it's trying to walk with people rather than like sitting across from them. That was a way I was trying to think about it, but at the same time there can be limits, like in moments where distance really comes up.
This makes a very interesting parallel with what you were saying there now, yesterday, like this idea of trying to think of an immersive space rather than one that you're in front of in the end, with very, very different methods, tools, and I'm not, the parallel ends here, I think, but it's still like being carrying with or trying to get nearby is, of course, like demands specific forms of expressions and mediums that need to be worked on. Maybe as a conclusion, I mean, it's interesting that we came back on the notion of dream. Yesterday, a lot was said about. I think it was a quote from Gabriella. Unfortunately, like I'm missing the person who was saying that you Westerners dreams a lot, but only about yourself. And so it's very interesting to think of the fact that dreams have been captured by a certain tradition of individualism, which in itself has locked certain practices, and so it's, of course, like extremely interesting and important to remind ourselves that like the way that we navigate within the world could be unpacked, and that certain associations are problematic, and therefore, like, you know, like that there's an entire, you know, set of articulation that can allow to make ourselves available to a different relationship to the space that we want to inhabit. That's, maybe I'm saying that as a conclusion for this session. I want again to give a warm round of applause to our two speakers.